Hey, I'm Dr. Newman. This is English 235, Critical Approaches to Literature, and in this video we're going to talk about the history of literary study at the university, or in other words, i.e., that's Latin for id est, which means that is. Why is there such a thing as an English major? And joining me here is my bro, Samuel Johnson, who not only wrote the first dictionary of English, but also was one of the first, he's called sometimes the father of literary criticism. He wrote a lot of critical works in the 18th century, and his critical essays are still classics. He's a wonderful writer. Some of his ideas are kind of cracked, but he's a very good writer. And yeah, so let's talk about the history. I'm a medievalist, which means I like to go way back to the sources of things. I like when I encounter an idea, I like to know its genealogy. You know, I like to trace it right back up the tree and see where it started. So why do people interpret poems and books and stories and think about them and write down what they think? We've been doing it for a long time. It goes back to the classical world. It goes back to ancient Athens, at least as in the West, as far as we know, where they studied grammar and rhetoric, in part so that they could better understand works by the Greek poets Homer and Hesiod, who were not only great poets to them, but they were religious writers. They believed in Zeus and Hera and all those people. And so these were considered sacred texts, and they were studied as sacred texts that had secret meanings that could be interpreted and unlocked, especially in the Hellenistic world, that is like the later Greek world. And so tons of commentaries were written, both trying to understand these texts on the literal level as the language got more and more different, right? Just like our language is different from Chaucer or Shakespeare, as time went by, the language of classical authors like Homer or the great tragedians like Aeschylus and Euripides and stuff became more and more in the past. And so being able to read that required formal study of the grammar of classical Greece. A similar thing happened in the Roman world, in imitation of the Greek world, except they used the Latin language, and their great authors were especially Virgil, who wrote a imitation of Homer called the Aeneid, about the founding of Rome, that was like treated like a sacred text that had like secret philosophical meanings. And of course, in the ancient Near East, in Judea, Palestine, there was another tradition of textual study focused around the law, the prophets, and the writings of the Hebrew scriptures that had its own apparatus of learning and commentary and study that continues to this day in the tradition of rabbinical Judaism. And which carried on into the Christian tradition of textual study and interpretation as well. And that went on into the medieval world in Western Europe from 500 into 1500. And there are other traditions in China and India and elsewhere that have traditions of literary study, but I'm not going to pretend to know anything about them. They're interesting topics. They don't lead directly to the modes of literary study that we are looking at in this class, which is maybe a short deficiency on my part, but you can't do everything. So yeah, the medieval world, they studied grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Those were considered the language arts. And those made up the trivium, which you studied first before moving on to the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Together they made up the 7 liberal arts, pictured here as ladies in pretty dresses in this medieval illustration. There's philosophy in the middle with a crown on. There's Socrates and Plato, and there's grammar at the top, who's you can't unlock anything else if you don't know the basic literal meanings of things. And so grammar is at the top with her quill and her book. Rhetoric is over here with a stylus and a tablet. There's astronomy, looking at some stars, and so on and so forth. These were considered, the 7 liberal arts were considered the gateway to wisdom. And so if you were going to become a literate, educated person in the Middle Ages, you studied these. And in the Middle Ages, you studied them in Latin, and it was all usually preparation for life in the clergy, because most of the people who could read or write for most of the Middle Ages belonged to the church. Not as parishioners or lay people, but as clerics. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment, you get an explosion of lay learning, of secular learning outside of the religious world, which includes an increased attention on rhetoric as opposed to just grammar and logic. The figure of the orator, the statesman who gives speeches and can persuade other people, becomes a kind of culture hero in the Republican city-states of northern Italy. And there was this sort of sense of recovering a lost legacy of the ancient world, which is kind of true and kind of not, but they did study grammar and rhetoric in Latin, Greek, along different lines that they did in the Middle Ages. And the composition of poetry continues from the Middle Ages and through the 18th century to be an important part of literary learning. You learn to appreciate great poets by writing poetry in imitation of them. And this poetry writing is not like a creative writing workshop where it's about finding your voice. It's about learning to appreciate the greatness of the masters by attempting to imitate them. And this is how early modern authors like Shakespeare and Milton and Amelia Lanier and others learned to write by composing imitations, and frequently in Greek and Latin, but increasingly as we get towards the 18th century in English. And part of this has to do with the nationalism and the rise of the nation state and the increasing sense by English speakers of the value of their own language, that English wasn't just a kind of lesser language to Greek and Latin, but that it was a language of a great people in its own right. And this is where we come into the 19th century with the status of English in the modern university. It is in the 19th century that the modern university really is born. The university goes back to the medieval world, right, where it was really used for training upper clergy for philosophy and for theology in particular. And theology and philosophy and the classics, along with medicine and law, continued to be the focus of university study through the 18th century. Although in the 18th century, you start to get more and more the study of science as well. Physical science, what they would have called in the early modern period, natural philosophy. Okay. So in the 18th century, or in the 19th century, you get the modern university where you start getting departments of chemistry and physics and geology and biology, but also economics and not just philosophy, but political science. You get this explosion of all these different disciplines. And whereas up until the 19th century, if you studied literature at the university, you studied classics, you studied Greek and Latin, and maybe if you were super specialized, you might study Persian or Sanskrit or something like that. I don't know, Sanskrit was only just being discovered at the end of the 18th century. But you didn't study English literature. You didn't study Milton and Shakespeare, because obviously that's just what an educated person read in their free time, right? If you're a cultivated gentleman in your study with your hound dog on your armchair, you're just picking up some Chaucer and just reading it for the lols, right? You're not, if you want to do serious work, you're going to read Greek and Latin. This changes in the 19th century in two ways. That has to do with two different tracks of literary study that emerged in the 19th century. One we might call Belles-Lettres, or Belles-Lettres, and this is an approach to literature that's kind of like appreciation, we might call it. It's like music appreciation versus music theory. This is kind of analogous to the two strains of literary study in the 19th century. And Belles-Lettres was literary appreciation. You learned to judge and appreciate and understand great works of literature and understand why they were great. And this was meant to create a person who had good taste and good character and could be a good member of the middle and upper middle class, because they had aesthetic refinement and were not vulgar. The guy pictured in this cartoon from 1871 here, Matthew Arnold, one of the great literary critics of the 19th century, but had a very specific Victorian view of literary criticism as being for the purpose of evaluating and upholding works of high seriousness like Shakespeare and Milton. And Matthew Arnold was himself a kind of a failed Christian. He's somebody who's had a crisis of faith, and I guess, and didn't find in religious revelation the kind of certainties that he was looking for. And so he went to human culture with the same kind of devotion that a Christian will bring, or a religious person will bring to their sacred texts. And he believed that literature could improve characters and refined manners. Hated Mark Twain, by the way, as I learned from a student presentation here at Missouri State at our undergraduate literary conference this spring. Anyway, so that's the belletristic approach, as it's sometimes called. That's the adjective form of Belles-Lettres. And this was considered also, as upper class women start to trickle into the university at the end of the 19th century, this is considered an appropriate course of study for a well-bred young lady who's going to meet a good husband at the university, and where she will read great works of literature and become a good conversation partner to her husband and a good tutor to her virtuous Victorian children. On the other hand, the other approach we might identify with what's called philology, which is the source of historical linguistics. It's the scholarly study of historical written sources. This is not about appreciating Shakespeare and Milton for the refinement of their writing and their instillment of good character and judgment and universal wisdom. It's about reading really, really old, hard stuff and using all the kind of scientific and scholarly skills to interpret the hardest stuff that you can read. It's about finding the oldest fragments of classical or medieval manuscripts that you can and trying to solve them like a puzzle. It involves textual criticism, which is establishing correct texts. This is the tradition of textual criticism goes back to the Reformation in some ways, where when Luther and Calvin and others were saying that salvation does not depend upon the teachings of the church, it depends on Scripture alone. It's only through understanding Scripture alone that we can come to grace and so on. And so therefore, having the right Scripture is really important. So we're we can't have the Latin Scripture because that's all Catholic and bad according to Luther and Calvin. We need to go back to the Greek version. Well, oh no, when we go back to the Greek version, we find that there's hundreds of different manuscripts, all with different variations. What's the real version of the Greek Bible? And so they developed techniques of comparison and kind of plotting family trees of text to try to lead back to the original version. And in doing so, they learned a lot about language and language change over time. That was then in the 19th century, under the influence of nationalism and saying, well, what is the spirit of the English or the German or the Danish people? Let's go back and study our national classics, like the newly rediscovered Beowulf, and try to figure out what this means and what it can tell us about the world that it came from. And so historical linguistics develops as the discipline of tracing the development of modern and classical languages. And this is kind of an essayistic. Belles-Lettres is kind of writing, where we get kind of writing essays about things, where we talk about what they mean and what their value is in terms of our own culture and concerns. Philology is about this kind of technical, objective sort of study of old literature to try to figure out what the literal meaning was. And these are kind of two streams of literary study in the 19th century that influenced the development of critical approaches to literature in the 20th century. Let's get into the 20th century. English majors had been established and with English departments in the second half of the 19th century. In them, you had both the belletristic scholars and the philological ones who kind of debated the purpose of what the literary major and what literature academic departments should focus on: criticism or scholarship, so to speak, as the distinction is sometimes put. And we get new modes of critical approaching literature in the early 20th century, besides the belletristic and the philological. Increasingly, we get moral modes where we think about tragedy and stuff like that in terms of the kind of what it can teach us, which I guess is connected to belletristic, but is slightly more of a moral flavor. But we also get the beginnings of Marxist and psychoanalytic criticism. Marxist theorists wanted to look at literature as a reflection of class relationships, class struggle, what art has to say about society and social organization. There were other kinds of critics who were interested in that too, who weren't explicitly Marxists, but were influenced maybe by other types of sociological thinkers, by like Weber, Durkheim, stuff like that. And you also get psychoanalytic criticisms who are not interested in society as a whole, but in the individual psyche. And they're especially influenced by the theories of Sigmund Freud and his followers, which will view the literary work as a symptom of the repressed urges and unconscious drives of the psyche. All of these modes of criticism have had a very important influence in the 20th and 21st centuries, and in some ways we can trace back a lot of the later iterations as being all kind of variations on some of these. In some ways we can see feminism as a kind of moral criticism, and as in some ways as a kind of Marxist criticism, and actually it kind of mixes up all these. We'll get back to that. An important thing happens in the middle of the 20th century, the Second World War. Which is important for a lot of reasons, but in terms of higher education in the United States, during the Second World War, Congress passes something called the GI Bill, which promises a university of education to all the returning soldiers. Now, before this time, university education had been a pretty elite thing. It was like for the country club set. It was for like the top 5% at the most, right? Most people did not go to college. There were efforts in the 19th and early 20th century to create more access for education for more and more people. But generally speaking, it was still before the World War II, a lot of people, the majority of Americans didn't even graduate from high school. So there was a really kind of an revolution in the middle of the 20th century in terms of what expectations were about what kind of education people needed and could get. And so you get all of these people who are first generation students who maybe didn't finish high school, who are now going to the university and are sitting there in an English class. And this is when the new criticism, which we're learning about this week, really comes into its heyday, because the new criticism had a lot of features to it that was really useful for teaching classes that didn't have elite educations coming in. They didn't know history, and they hadn't read the classics. They didn't know Greek and Latin. They maybe necessarily hadn't read much Shakespeare or Milton or Chaucer or anything like that. They didn't go to fancy private schools, and so the new criticism was useful because it was decontextualized, as you'll learn this week. It didn't require a lot of understanding of what was going on in the Elizabethan world to understand a Shakespearean poem. You just look at the poem. You isolate the text, right? That's part of the new critical method. It's also, to a certain extent, apolitical. You're not looking as a new critic for the social struggles or the class concerns or the identities of the people involved, right? It's very individualistic. It's very focused on just this text itself as a little artifact. And this itself made it safe at a time when there was a lot of paranoia about politics because of the Cold War. This guy up here, Charles Muscatine, he was a famous scholar of Chaucer who lost his job at the University of California because he refused to take loyalty oaths that were instituted by McCarthyites. These were rabid anti-communists who were purging lots of people who were accused of communism from government jobs, from teacher jobs, from librarian jobs, and were attempting to remove what they considered to be radical or dangerous ideas from the public sphere and from education. Good thing we've evolved past all that. Anyway, Muscatine sued and won and resumed his job at the University of California, and he's based, as the kids say. Louise Rosenblatt here in the 30s and 40s invented a mode of criticism that really was reader response theory. And Stanley Fish basically often gets credit for the invention of reader response theory several decades later, but Louise Rosenblatt had a lot of those ideas first. And this is just an instance of how the achievements and contributions of women are either often discounted, discredited, reattributed, or ignored. And so that's going to take us into later into the 20th century, into the 60s and 70s. Woo! This is sort of in terms of its institutional prominence, this is the heyday of the English major. We get the most jobs for English professors, the greatest number of English majors at universities, the largest proportion of people studying English. University was a hell of a lot cheaper at the time, and so it was a lot easier to argue to your parents, I think, in the 1960s, if you're only paying like $5 a credit hour, that I'm going to study English, I'm going to read poetry or whatever, and nowadays it's like, well, we're paying tens and thousands of dollars, so you're going to go into business or nursing. But in the 60s and 70s, those pressures didn't exist. There was a lot of public funding for universities because of the GI Bill. And we get an explosion of different topics and different theories for approaching critical literature. And we're going to go through and we're going to look at a lot of these in this class, including a set of theories involving that really examine the philosophy of language and how these deep understandings of how language works, shapes our understanding of literature. And those are structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction. We're going to look at feminist criticism, which rose in correspondence with the rise of the women's movements in the 60s and 70s, which sought to center the concerns of women and to recover the achievement of women writers, among other things. Reader response criticism, which is a direct response to new criticism, which we'll talk more about that. Psychoanalysis, archetypal criticism. There's all these different kind of new ways of approaching criticism that exploded at this time. At the same time, new criticism continued to be the orthodoxy that was taught in the classroom. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of these theories continued in new iterations. In some ways, what had been revolutionary new approaches in the 60s and 70s become institutionalized and orthodox in various ways in the 80s and 90s, and what's sometimes referred to as the triumph of theory. And we get new kinds of socially concerned theories like new historicism, a return of Marxism. We get new iterations of psychoanalysis through the version of psychoanalysis that comes from the French thinker Jacques Lacan. And we get the further development in kind of analogy to feminism of various identity-based criticisms, including queer theory and gender studies. Judith Butler is kind of the godparent of these. It's weird to have lived long enough to see what was a pretty obscure academic kind of theories become the object of widespread cultural debate in the 2010s and 2020s. And we get, other area studies, African American, Chicano, Asian American. In the last 10 years, we have seen the proliferation of indigenous studies, more in Canada than in the United States, but here as well. And with the rise of this, we also get a kind of reaction formation, a kind of backlash against all of these new theories, and especially identity-based criticisms with what really, now it's consumed our entire culture. Then it was confined to more cultural and literary and education sort of zones, what we might call the culture wars, debates about the canon, what gets taught and what doesn't, debates about the role of area studies in higher education, debates about the purpose of a university education. And as all this is going on, the number of English majors begins to decline, and public funding of universities begins to decline. And the golden age is sadly past. But we're still doing great work here, and we're going to learn about all this and discuss all of this while reading some great texts and just some important things that I'd like you to think about moving forward. What are some of the important trends that we've witnessed in the 21st century? You're going to do group projects towards the end of the semester where you approach some of these. One such approach in the 21st century, which we will be talking about, is critical race theory. As this poster here by the great scholar Kim Hall, a Shakespearean, who talks about the role of race and racial categories in Shakespeare's art. But I wonder sometimes what people in 2040 will think about when they look back at our present moment, and I wonder why you're majoring in English or English education or creative writing. Is it what you expected? I hope that it's more. And I hope that you enjoy this class, and I'm looking forward to going on this adventure as we take a deeper dive into all of these different approaches to literature together. Thank you for listening to this whole video. Bye!